Push on, men, not cross at all costs! Aye, sir! Front nine! Enemy ahead! Hold the line!
March 22, 1945. While British Field Marshal Montgomery prepared the largest river crossing operation in military history, complete with 5,000 artillery guns, aerial bombardment, and 22,000 paratroopers, American General George Patton made a phone call that would infuriate his rival forever. "Brad, for God's sake, tell the world we're across. We knocked down 33 Krauts today when they came after our pontoon bridges. I want the world to know that 3rd Army made it before Monty starts across." His 3rd Army had just crossed the Rhine River in complete silence. No bombs, no artillery, no fanfare, just boats in the darkness. And he beat Montgomery by exactly 24 hours.
Patton crosses the Rhine first. Macron wall.
This wasn't just about winning a race. It was about two men who despised each other, fighting for glory while fighting Hitler. What happened next would become one of the most legendary moments of World War II. George Patton and Bernard Montgomery hated each other with a passion that bordered on obsession. It started in North Africa, escalated in Sicily, and by 1945, their rivalry had become almost as important to them as defeating Germany itself. Montgomery called Patton reckless and unsophisticated, a cowboy playing soldier. Patton called Montgomery that cautious son of a bitch, who had no more tactical skill than an army cook and moved slower than molasses in winter. But beneath the insults lay something deeper. Two brilliant generals competing for the same prize, being first into the heart of Nazi Germany, and earning their place in history as the man who delivered the final blow to Hitler's Reich.
The headlines are mine, Monty. The Rhine is ours.
By early 1945, the Rhine River stood as the last major barrier before the Allied armies could pour into Germany's industrial heartland. Montgomery, as commander of the 21st Army Group, received top priority from Supreme Commander Eisenhower. His Operation Plunder was designed to be the main assault, a textbook example of overwhelming force that would demonstrate British military superiority. Meanwhile, Patton commanded the 3rd Army further south, constantly frustrated by what he saw as Montgomery getting preferential treatment in supplies, reinforcements, and glory. The pattern had repeated throughout the war with maddening consistency. During the dash across France in August 1944, Patton's army ran out of fuel just as they reached the Moselle River, within striking distance of the German border. Why? Because Eisenhower had diverted precious gasoline supplies to Montgomery's Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands. Patton's units received only 25,390 gallons of fuel, just 1/18 of what he had requested and needed to maintain momentum. While Montgomery prepared his elaborate northern offensive with full logistical support, Patton sat idle near Metz, watching his chance to end the war quickly slip away. His tanks were empty, his men were ready, but the fuel went north to Montgomery. The Moselle incident festered in Patton's mind like an infected wound. He believed the war could have been over by Christmas 1944 if he'd been allowed to keep advancing. Instead, Market Garden failed spectacularly, and the war dragged on through a brutal winter. Now, in March 1945, Patton was determined not to let it happen again. Intelligence reports showed German defenses crumbling along the entire front. The enemy was exhausted, disorganized, and running low on everything from ammunition to soldiers. Patton wanted a quick, spectacular crossing that would produce newspaper headlines and prove his methods superior to Montgomery's cautious approach. By March 1945, the rivalry had transcended military strategy. It had become personal. It had become about legacy, about who would be remembered as the greatest general of the war, and Patton was willing to bend or break orders to make sure that when the history books were written, his name would shine brighter than Montgomery's. The Rhine River wasn't just a military objective anymore. It was the stage for the final act of the greatest rivalry in World War II. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery was planning what he believed would be his crowning achievement, the operation that would cement his reputation as the most brilliant military mind of the 20th century. Operation Plunder would demonstrate how a proper military operation should be conducted, with meticulous planning, overwhelming force, and minimal casualties. Everything that George Patton wasn't. This would be Montgomery's masterpiece, and the entire world would watch him conduct it with the precision of a symphony conductor leading an orchestra. Montgomery's operation involved a 3-army assault that would dwarf anything attempted during the war. The plan included an airborne assault called Operation Varsity, a 5,000-gun artillery barrage that would obliterate German defenses, and waves of Anglo-American bombers that would turn the eastern bank into a moonscape. Thousands of tons of supplies moved forward daily, including massive amounts of bridging equipment, more than had been used in any previous river crossing in history. Engineers constructed dummy installations and false radio traffic to deceive the Germans about the crossing location. The 1st Allied Airborne Army would conduct Operation Varsity, dropping over 22,000 paratroopers on the eastern bank in support of the river crossing. It would be the largest airborne operation of the entire war, larger even than D-Day's airborne component. Montgomery coordinated every detail personally, from the timing of the artillery barrage to the exact minute the paratroopers would jump. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing would go wrong. Montgomery scheduled the crossing for the night of March 23rd. The date was set months in advance. The world was watching. Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself would be there to observe, along with top Allied commanders and journalists from around the globe. This would be Montgomery's moment, proof that careful, systematic warfare could succeed where American recklessness might fail. He'd been preparing for months, coordinating every detail with obsessive attention. But Montgomery had two problems gnawing at him. The first was that on March 7th, American forces had unexpectedly captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, becoming the first Allied troops to cross the Rhine. That stole some of his thunder, though Montgomery consoled himself that Remagen was a lucky break, not a planned operation. A tactical accident rather than strategic genius. The bridge had collapsed anyway, and the bridgehead remained contained. The second problem was more serious and more immediate. George Patton was racing toward the river from the south with his Third Army, and everyone in the Allied command knew that Patton didn't follow scripts, didn't respect proper procedure, and cared more about glory than good sense. Patton remained concerned that Eisenhower might put the First and Third Armies on the defensive while allocating 10 American divisions to Montgomery's 21st Army Group. This fear drove him to act with characteristic aggression. Montgomery's elaborate preparations, meant to ensure success, gave Patton exactly what he needed, a deadline to beat and a rival to humiliate in front of the world. While Montgomery orchestrated his symphony of destruction with every instrument perfectly tuned, Patton was planning to sneak across in the night like a thief, stealing Montgomery's thunder and his glory. On March 19th, General Omar Bradley gave Patton the order he'd been waiting for his entire military career: cross the Rhine. But there was a catch that would have discouraged most commanders. Patton had to move with impossible speed. Each day, even each hour, gave the Germans additional time to recover from the debacle in the Saar-Palatinate and prepare Rhine defenses. More importantly, and everyone knew this was the real reason, Montgomery's crossing was scheduled for March 23rd. If Patton wanted to beat him and claim the glory, he had only 4 days to prepare an operation that should take weeks. Most commanders would have said it was impossible, that the logistics alone made it a fool's errand. Assault boats, bridging equipment, and other engineering supplies had to be hauled from depots far in the rear across war-torn France. The magnitude of the task was argument enough for delaying until at least the 23rd, the same day as Montgomery's crossing, which would still save face. But Patton refused to accept delay or share the spotlight. He'd been planning this moment for months, quietly stockpiling equipment. Convoys started rolling forward immediately with boats and bridging materials that had been carefully maintained in Lorraine since the previous fall. Every hour mattered now. Patton selected the town of Oppenheim for his crossing, a place the Germans wouldn't expect an assault. The location wasn't ideal from a textbook perspective. To avoid a second crossing operation at the main river, which joins the Rhine at Mainz, Patton accepted the handicap of having to cross the Main later, in exchange for achieving surprise at the Rhine. It was classic Patton, trade textbook logic for audacity, gamble on speed over security, and hit the enemy where they weren't looking. On the night of March 22nd, elements of Major General S. Leroy Irwin's 5th Infantry Division approached the Rhine in complete darkness. Patton had ordered absolute silence. No artillery barrage to announce their presence, no aerial bombardment to alert every German within 50 miles. Just soldiers and boats, rowing quietly across Germany's greatest natural barrier while the enemy slept. The men moved like ghosts, whispering orders, muffling oarlocks, praying the Germans wouldn't hear them coming across the dark water. The gamble paid off spectacularly. The Germans were completely surprised, caught sleeping or manning positions facing the wrong direction. Resistance was minimal and disorganized. By morning, the division suffered a total of just 34 dead and wounded, an astonishingly low casualty rate for such a major operation. 6 battalions were across the Rhine, and combat engineers were already building pontoon bridges to bring tanks and heavy equipment over. The operation Patton had been dreaming about for months, that he'd been preparing for since the Moselle setback, was a stunning success. Now came the part he'd been waiting for even more than the crossing itself, telling the world he'd beaten Montgomery, and watching his rival's reaction when the news hit. Patton picked up the field phone with a smile on his face, ready to make history. At midnight on March 22nd, with his troops still consolidating their positions on the eastern bank of the Rhine, Patton picked up the phone and called his immediate superior, General Omar Bradley. His voice barely contained his excitement and barely concealed his glee at what he was about to do to Montgomery's carefully planned moment. "Brad, for God's sake, tell the world we're across. We knocked down 33 Krauts today when they came after our pontoon bridges. I want the world to know that 3rd Army made it before Monty starts across." Bradley understood immediately what Patton was really asking for. This wasn't just about military achievement or proper reporting through channels. It was about headlines, glory, and putting Montgomery in his place in front of the entire world. Bradley, who had his own frustrations with Montgomery's attitude toward American generals, needed little convincing. He released news of the crossing to the press at a time calculated to take some of the luster from the news of Montgomery's crossing. The timing was perfect, or perfectly insulting, depending on whether you were American or British. The next morning, March 23rd, at Bradley's headquarters, one of Patton's staff officers made an announcement to assembled reporters that dripped with calculated malice. The 3rd Army had crossed the Rhine at 10 p.m. on March 22nd, he declared, without the benefit of aerial bombing, ground smoke, artillery preparation, and airborne assistance. Every single word was a deliberate jab at Montgomery, who was using all those assets at that very moment for his own crossing just miles to the north. The implication was clear. Patton had done with silence and stealth what Montgomery needed an entire army group and massive bombardment to accomplish. Patton couldn't resist adding his own theatrical touch to cement the moment in history. The following day, he arrived at the pontoon bridge his engineers had constructed across the Rhine. Halfway across, he suddenly stopped. Making absolutely sure an army photographer was ready and had a clear shot, Patton unzipped his fly and urinated into the Rhine River. When he reached the eastern side, he pretended to stumble, then leaped to his feet, clutching 2 handfuls of German earth and exclaiming, thus, William the Conqueror. It was pure theater, vintage Patton showmanship designed for maximum headlines and maximum humiliation of his rival. That evening, still giddy with triumph, he sent a message to Eisenhower at Supreme Headquarters. "Dear Schaff, I have just pissed into the Rhine River. For God's sake, send some gasoline." The reference to gasoline was another dig, a reminder of the Moselle incident when supplies had gone to Montgomery instead. The American press went absolutely wild with the story. Patton was front-page news across the United States, portrayed as the daring general who crossed the Rhine with minimal casualties, while the cautious British were still preparing their elaborate assault. The cowboy who beat the careful British planner, the American who showed the world how it should be done. It was exactly the story Patton wanted told, exactly the image he wanted to project, and exactly the humiliation he wanted to inflict on Montgomery. Montgomery's reaction was predictable. Cold, controlled British rage that burned with the intensity of a white-hot coal. Publicly, he said absolutely nothing. He couldn't. His operation was underway. Thousands of men were in combat, and he had a professional job to finish regardless of what that American cowboy had done. But privately, those close to Montgomery reported, the insult burned deep into his pride. This was supposed to be his moment, his vindication, his proof that British military methods were superior. Instead, the world was reading about Patton urinating in the Rhine. Though beaten across the Rhine by Patton's 3rd Army by a full day, Montgomery's meticulous Operation Plunder shone in its flawless execution. His crossing on the night of March 23rd went exactly as planned, like clockwork, without a single significant deviation from the carefully prepared schedule. 5,500 artillery pieces bombarded the eastern bank in a barrage that could be heard 50 miles away. Allied bombers pounded the town of Wesel into rubble, eliminating it as a strong point. The massive airborne drop was the largest of its kind during the entire war, and it achieved all its objectives with acceptable casualties. But none of it mattered for the history books or the newspaper headlines that would shape public memory. Patton had stolen his moment with perfect timing. The headlines weren't about Montgomery's careful planning, his overwhelming success, or his professional execution. They were all about Patton sneaking across in the dark like a commando, and then urinating in the river like a barbarian. For a man who valued proper military procedure and systematic warfare above all else, who believed that war should be conducted with dignity and professional excellence, it was the ultimate humiliation. What Montgomery said privately about Patton's crossing was never officially recorded in any document, but those close to him reported that he was livid, using language rarely heard from the proper British field marshal. The entire incident reinforced Montgomery's view of American generals as glory-seeking cowboys who cared more about headlines and personal fame than proper military conduct or the lives of their men. But he was also a realist who understood military facts. Patton had achieved a genuine tactical success with minimal casualties. Here's the truth that neither man wanted to admit because it would diminish their rivalry. They both succeeded brilliantly at their respective objectives. Patton's crossing at Oppenheim cost minimal casualties and demonstrated that speed, surprise, and audacity could overcome prepared defenses when conditions were right. Montgomery's Operation Plunder was a masterpiece of military planning that broke German resistance in the north permanently and opened the road to the Ruhr industrial region. Both crossings achieved their strategic objectives. Both helped end the war. Both saved lives in the long run, but neither man could see it that way, and neither man wanted to see it that way. For Patton and Montgomery, there could only be one winner, one hero, one general who would be remembered by history as the true conqueror of the Rhine. Their rivalry, which had consumed them throughout the entire war from North Africa to the heart of Germany, turned what should have been a shared triumph into a bitter competition for glory. In the end, Patton got his headlines and his moment of glory that made him a legend in America. Montgomery got the satisfaction of knowing his operation was professionally superior and more significant strategically, and both men went to their graves believing the other had received too much credit for too little achievement. That's what happens when military genius collides with personal ego, when professional excellence meets burning ambition. The Rhine crossings of March 1945 weren't just about defeating Nazi Germany. They were about two men who absolutely couldn't stand to be in second place behind anyone, especially each other.